Right. I did forget to dismiss the children, but it looks like they made their way out. I told Bob that I was going to preach on one thing and then totally changed it 2 days ago. Was going to preach out of 1 Corinthians 13 about love. But I'm going to say that we'll talk about that tonight. So 6 o'clock tonight, if you guys want to join us, we're going to just read through the 13th chapter, and we're just going to kind of pick apart what God has desired for us for love, his love for us, and how we need to love others, and what that means to us. So tonight, 6 o'clock, little plug for that. I will be there, so don't skip out just because of that. Anyways, all right, enough of that. I did want to share something. Like I tell every time I come up here and talk, it's always something that God has dealt with me, something that God has just been working in my heart, and I just want to share it with everybody else. This one here, I want to share the story of Elijah, not the whole story, but just a part of it. This one here is a little more intimate to me, because in just talking about it and how God has been dealing with me, sometimes it can arise certain pain and hurt and kind of expose certain parts of my heart that need to be dealt with. And sometimes it brings up a little bit of doubt and a little bit of just not knowing where God's got you sometimes. So it's a sensitive thing for me, and I hope that you guys can kind of see God's heart through this, and hopefully it'll ring true for you guys too. So I hope you guys just bear with me as I go through this and share it with you. I want to start in 1 Kings 17. I'm going to be reading a lot of scripture. I didn't have anything up there for that, so Bob's a little more up on the technology with that than I am. But I wanted to start with you to kind of set the base. The previous chapters, they're talking about the different kings of Israel. And you've got good kings, you got bad kings, kings that followed God and led a godly nation. You have kings that fell away from God and served other idols and things like that. And here we're getting to King Ahab. And I want to read that for you guys real quick. It says, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel. And he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. He began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built for Samaria. Ahab also made an Ashereth pole and did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all the kings of Israel before him. You guys are starting to get an idea of this is not a very godly or good king here. It goes on, it says, in Ahab's time, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn son, Abiram, and he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. Here we get into Elijah's story here. He goes, now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab. Now, if you guys can imagine, it's kind of like us trying to get to the president and talk to him. You can't just go up and talk to him. You can't just call him on the phone. You have to ask permission to do that. It has to go through a certain chain of command, and the king would have to actually say, yes, I'll be willing to talk to this person. And so it's not an easy task. You can't just go up and talk to the king. And let alone whether it's a bad king or a good king. It's like if you said something that the king didn't like, he could take away your property, he could kill you. And we've already kind of know the background of King Ahab. He's not a godly king, he's evil. And Elijah knows this going into this, but God tells him to do something, and I'm going to finish reading that here. It says he goes up, he said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Now, you can just imagine, or at least I can imagine, him going up to the king and just being able to speak to him. One, already kind of sets the king off balance there and says, whoa, who are you? I'm sure he knew who he was, but like, who are you to come up to just talk to me? And then he kind of punishes him. The thing is, he goes, as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, basically on someone that has more authority than you, I'm going to command there to be no water at all for several years. And so you can imagine he's already challenging his authority as king, saying that, I don't care if you're king, this is what's going to happen. God and I have already talked it over. This is what we're planning to do. And of course, God is amazing in his perfect timing. And then it says, then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here. So turn eastward and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook. I have ordered the ravens to feed you there. So that was definitely good timing. After you talk to the king, he's like, okay, now get out of there. You're in danger. And so he does take care of him. And so he goes off to the ravine. He said he did what the Lord said to him. He went to the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Okay, so we get to this point. At this point, he's obviously listening to God. He hears God's voice real clearly to go speak boldly to this king, tell him what's going to happen, what God's plan is, and then he leaves. And he didn't just, it's not like, hey, let's go camping for a little bit. You're going to, pack up a few things and go. It's like he had to leave everything. I'm sure he had to leave his home, his possessions, his friends, his family, his stature, his position, and now he's fleeing for his life. Not only is he having to hide, the king is probably sending out people to find him, to kill him, or to bring him back to be killed. He's now living on basically the bare minimum. He's having to drink water from a brook, and the birds are bringing him food just twice a day. I know we're accustomed to 3 or more, little snacks in between. At least I am. I eat all the time. Anyways, but just bread and meat brought to him by ravens. And so we see all of a sudden now him obeying God has led him into a position of danger, a sacrifice, and living off the bare essentials, barely just getting by, just his needs being met. Okay, and it says sometime later. Now it doesn't say. It says sometimes later the brook dried up. Now that really depends. I don't know how long it is, if it was a couple weeks, if it was several months. It doesn't really say. If it was Alva, it would have been the next day, because it doesn't take long for things to dry up here. It says the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him. I want to stop there. It says the water dried up because there was no rain in the land. And I just want to kind of overemphasize here why there was no rain in the land. Why is there a drought? There's a drought because there's no rain. And there's no rain because Elijah commanded there to be no rain. And there's no rain, and he commanded it because God had led him to that. All right? So he is now suffering. The king is suffering. The whole Israel is now going through a drought, him included, Elijah included, because he obeyed God. And I'll come back to that as well. It says, then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I've commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was gathering sticks. He called her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so that I might have a drink? And I was kind of laughed because I heard another preacher talk about this, and he goes, isn't it just like a guy? Because it goes on and says, can you get me a drink of water? And he goes on and goes, as she was getting it, he called, and can you bring me, please, a piece of bread, too? It's just, like, hey, while you're up, since you're up and getting this already, can you go ahead and make me a sandwich, too? And which I think is pretty respectable, because I remember growing up, and I think my little sister can attest to this, is like, Mom had the ability to ask you for something and just knew when you were going to sit down. She knew when, like, as soon as you sit down, it's like, oh, wait, can you get this too? And I'm like, oh, okay. So at least he didn't wait till she got back and sat down and relaxed again. So it goes on and says, as surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread. I only have a flour and a jar and a little oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. So, and I know that God has told him to do this, and maybe just because I'm a little bit weaker in my faith or something, but if God told me to go to somebody and says, hey, they're going to feed you, I'm like, okay. Then I get there and I see them, and I'm like, oh, they have a lot less than I do. And then she says, well, I don't have anything. I have just enough to make for my son and I, and then we're just going to die because we have no money. We have no other means of resources. She's a widow. So there's no husband to help out. And I see that, and I'm like, oh, I feel bad taking money from somebody that has way less than me, you know. But he believes God, and Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as I said. But first make me a small cake from what you have and bring it to me. Then something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord God of Israel says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord gives rain on the land. So he still continues on with that. God told him to do that. And I know that if I probably would have came into something like that, I would have questioned God a little bit, like, is this the right person? Is it not this person over here? Because they look like I've got some money to spare and some extra food. But he goes on and says, do this. And then God blesses her. And what I notice here is that earlier on, it says, she goes, as surely as the Lord your God lives. So she doesn't claim as surely as my God lives, we don't have any food. So it leads me to believe that she doesn't believe in God, but he does. And so we see a miracle done. So this person, it leads me to believe that she's not a believer. She doesn't believe in God, but she's still being obedient to that because God had gone ahead and commanded her to do that. And so then he blesses her on top of that. Not a Christian, so that leads me to believe again that God can still bless whoever he wants. And he will also use whoever he wants. It says she went away and did as Elijah told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family, for the jar of flour did not get used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. And so at this point, when I'm reading this, it reminds me of all the times that, being in ministry and just being a Christian is like, I talk to a lot of people, whether they're Christians, whether they're not Christians, and I can imagine Elijah in this point being a prophet. I'm sure he's not wasting an opportunity to share God's love with them. And so I've had those moments myself where I'm talking to someone about, like, well, what about your God? And they want to know about it. I'm like, let me tell you about my God. And I get really excited about it. I'm like, my God is awesome. He's so loving. He's so kind. He's forgiven me of this. He's died for me. He's done this for me. He's given me this. He's done all these things. And I get excited and I get passionate. And I'm like, God, he's just so awesome. You need to know him. You need to come. You need to figure this out. You need to talk about this. And I'm assuming that he's the same way, doing the same thing, being a man of God. And then something happens. It says, sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse. And then he stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, what do you have against me? I just lost my spot. What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? And I've had those moments too, where, you're sharing God's love with somebody, and there's something in their life, whether it be another Christian who is not appropriately representing Christ's love, or maybe they feel judged somewhere else within the church, or something happens. In this case, her son dies. And I can imagine what's going through Elijah's like, God, what's going on? It's like, something good was happening here. I was sharing, you just blessed her. We have tons of food now that can live. You just saved her life. And this happened. I've had those moments myself where I pour so much into somebody and to share God's love and to share what he has for them. And then something comes along and just kind of like undercuts everything I just worked so hard for. But we still trust God. And he goes on and he goes, give me your son, Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him up to the upper room where he was staying, laid him on his bed. And I love this next part. It says that he cried out to the Lord, "O Lord, my God, have you brought tragedy upon this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die?" And again, it doesn't say this, but in my mind, it just kind of plays the fact that Elijah, she's, like a typical guy, we try to save face, and we're like, oh, yeah, he just died. No big deal. Being all macho, I'm like, okay, give me your son. We'll take care of this. Don't worry about it. And he gets into the room, shuts his door, and just kind of cries and crumbles like, oh, God, what's going on? I know I've done it before a lot of times, and that's just a guy thing, ladies. Sorry, we try to look, like we got it all together, and then behind the doors, we're just like, I don't. Have no idea. And that's kind of the image that comes to my mind here. So he cries out to the Lord and asks, why has this happened? And then he goes on, he says, he stretched himself out over the boy 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the boy, carried him down to the room of the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son's alive." Like it's just, again, like he comes out, kind of wipes the tears away, and then picks up his son and goes, "Oh, he's good to go." And so he does it. He says, "Look, your boy's alive." And here's a powerful thing here. It says, "The woman said to Elijah, 'Now I know you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is truth.'" Now I'm going to recap what's happening to Elijah. Elijah's situation has not changed. He's still going through a drought. He's still getting the bare minimum. What has changed is that he's no longer getting his food from a bird, but he is at least having some lady make it for him now. But he's still running for his life. He still has a warrant out for his rest, and he's still left everything behind. He's still in the drought like everybody else, getting just the bare minimum. I don't know what it's like to have to be on the run for my life, always looking around my shoulder, having to do this. I don't know what that's like, but I can only imagine it's not a good feeling. So on top of going through the drought like everybody else, he's having to be fearful of his life, but still doing what God tells him along the way. And he's been doing that. So I can only imagine that as a human, in our weakness, if I'm going through a hard time, if I'm going through my own droughts in life, and I'm following what God told me to do, and I'm doing exactly what he told me to do, and I'm seeing other people get blessed, and I'm still stuck in my situation, at some point I'm like, what's the deal? Okay, when's it my time? When's it my turn? When are you going to relieve me? And stuff. But we said up at the very beginning that God said this drought's going to happen for several years. And so his situation hasn't changed. But what we do notice is somebody else's situation has changed. Even though God has taken away from him, God has allowed suffering to fall upon him, he's blessed somebody else, not only with life, but they came to know God. They came to know God. And I'm going to go on from there. It goes on to some more stories. I'm not going to read it word for word, but I do want to share that. The story goes on to sometime later, during the drought still, God comes to Elijah and says, "Elijah, all right, I want you to have a meet and greet with King Ahab." And he's like, this is the king that we said this to, and he hates me, and he wants to kill me. He goes, "I know, it's going to happen. I need you to talk to him," stuff like that. So he's like, okay. So a messenger comes by, and he sends it off. He says, "Go to King Ahab and tell him that I want to meet with him." And the messenger is a godly man, and he goes, "Why would you do that to me? You know this is going to make him upset. He'll kill me for sure," and stuff. And he goes, "Don't worry, you'll be saved. Just go tell him that I want to meet with him." And so he gets together, and this is where the story comes together, is on Mount Carmel. And I talked about this a while back. And so he meets with King Ahab, and I can only imagine how furious he is, and he's just ready just to kill Elijah, just to be like, "Look what you've caused. We're all suffering here. We'll have to go through this thing because of you and your God," and he just get mad at him, stuff like that. But he comes up to him, and I would be pretty intimidated at this point, even though that's usually how it goes. God shows that he is God, and we quickly forget that he is God and that he's done these things. But he comes up to him not only by himself, but he has all of his armies, and he's got, it says, over 800 prophets and priests and people. So he basically just brought everybody with him and said, "Okay, what's the deal?" And so, again, Elijah speaks with boldness and says, and this is definitely a paraphrase, he's like, "Okay, I'm sick and tired of you guys flip-flopping back and forth, saying you're going to follow God, you don't follow God, you do, you don't. We're sick of it. God and I we're tired of it, and right now we're going to have a showdown. We're going to have a cage match style, my God versus your God, right now. Let's do it." And he challenges them to that. And he says, "Okay, I have never gotten to that position where I've had to say, okay, my God versus your God right now, let's do it." I haven't. Be kind of interested to get to that point. I'd like to get there. Hopefully my faith is strong enough in those moments to be able to do that. I guess it really doesn't matter if I'm strong enough, because it doesn't, because God is strong enough, and he's God, and I'm not. But he does that, and he agrees to it. He goes, "Okay." So they built 2 different altars. They had 2 different sacrifices on it, and he goes, "Okay, you guys go first." And so they got all the holy people, their priests and prophets or whatever, from these idols, and they danced around their sacrifice like half a day. For like 6 hours, they're dancing and they're chanting, and they're cutting themselves and stuff like that, because that was customary to them to do that. And they're crying out, and nothing happens. And eventually Elijah starts getting a little more bold and kind of cocky here, and he starts to make fun of them. He starts to mock them. He goes, maybe your God can't hear you. Maybe he's fallen asleep. Maybe maybe you need to chant louder. And so he just kind of taunts them and stuff like that. And so they do. They yell louder. They cry out louder to their God. But nothing happens. And eventually, Elijah says, okay, just quit. Just stop. You're embarrassing yourselves. He goes, okay, it's my turn. It's my turn now. And so he calls out to cry. And at this moment, again, in my own mind, I just think of just people being weak all the time, and we need to stop doing that, I guess. But I just think at this moment, it's kind of his time. He's going through this suffering. He's had to run. He's had to fear for his life. He's had to do what God's told him to do without getting any blessings, without getting any kind of reward, without any relief. But he's been faithful and faithful. And at this moment, I can just think about it. It's like him going up to me like, just stop. It's my time. And guess what? You're all in trouble. Because my God's going to show up, and he's going to show off, and he's going to do this, and I'm going to be the one on this side. I'm going to be right. You're going to be wrong. And sometimes it's easy to have that attitude. But he doesn't. He says something that really would shock most people. Basically, he prays for them. So as he calls out to God, this is his prayer. It says, at the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. I have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know you, O Lord, our God, and that you're turning their hearts back again. I remember there being times, just being a weak Christian, where I've prayed for people, but you pray for them to fall, or you pray for them to see the wrong that they're doing. You pray kind of against them. And this shows his maturity in Christ, or in God right here. He prays for him. One, he prays that God will be seen, that he won't be seen. He's done all these things, but he's done it because of God. And God has the power, not him. He says, I want you to be known. I want to be known as a servant. I'm not even close to you. And the other thing he does is he prays for them. I pray for them to know you, Lord, and I pray that their hearts will be changed back for you. I don't want you to show up just to show off. I want you to show up so their hearts will be transformed, that they will come to love you again. And it's really scary because not a lot of us always have that heart in those moments. We're going through those difficult times. We're suffering. We're going through these moments in life where we're just hurting and there's no relief and we don't know why. We don't understand it. We even have this feeling of like, I did something wrong. I did something wrong and God is punishing me. What has happened? I mean, we see the story of Job, all the stuff that God let happen to Job. His best friends, his companions that just sat there and mourned with him. They even said, what did you do? You must have sinned. You must have done something wrong. Otherwise, this wouldn't be happening to you. He says, I didn't do anything wrong. I mean, I think that if Christ, someone who's completely without blame, completely spotless, without sin, can be crucified on a cross and bear the weight of the burdens of this world and have to suffer, and he didn't do anything wrong, what makes me think that I shouldn't have to go through something too? Or it's someone else's fault? Or it's this? Sometimes it's not. Elijah was doing exactly what God told him to do, and he still had to go through suffering. But here's the deal, is that God does so much more through those moments than we even know. Because in those moments we think, God, where are you? I haven't heard from you. I don't feel your presence. Why are you letting this happen? And the thing is, God's always got a plan. He's always doing something. Here, he prays that prayer. And it says fire came down. And he also just drenched the sacrifice in water because he didn't want there to be an accident like a rock hitting another rock and it sparking and setting a fire. He wanted everybody to know without a matter of doubt that God set the fire. It said fire came down and consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the ground, and all the water. He left nothing. God showed up in a powerful way. And it says the people rejoiced. The people fell prostrate on the ground. They lay down on the ground and worshiped God. Still, Elijah's situation did not change. It didn't change, but it changed for the widow and her son, and it changed for this whole nation who came to God because he was willing to let God put him through some rough times so somebody else may come to know him. But God, being amazing as he is, he didn't just leave him with that alone. He told him, don't worry, the rain's coming. Don't worry, the drought will end. And I want to encourage anybody else who's going through those moments in life where whether you have caused something or you haven't caused something in your life for something bad to happen, if you're following exactly what God wants you to do, you're doing the best that you can, but you still feel like you're in those dry times, you're in those drought, you feel alone, but I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing. Why is this not working? How come you don't hear my cries? Why don't you answer me? Lord, where is the relief? God tells us, don't worry, the drought will end. The rain is coming. And we also have to realize that God does this for more than just us. As a church, it might be easy for us to say, you know what, let's empty the bank account. Let's sell our building, let's have church in a tent for now on and give all that money to help people in Alva. And we'll make these huge sacrifices if the whole town of Alva came to know God. We might be willing to say that, and we might be willing to do that. But are we willing to make those sacrifices? Are we willing to go through those rough times, even if it were to help one person, a widow, or somebody that is low in society, someone that nobody cares about, that no one would give a second thought to? Are we willing to make those sacrifices for them? Are we willing to go through those dry times? Are we willing to endure some suffering for somebody else so they can know God? So in closing, what I want to also share is that the reality is we do go through a lot of rough things. We each have stuff that we suffer with, that we have to deal with on a daily basis, and it's not a weekend pain. It may last for years, whether it's a broken relationship, whether it's feeling distance or God's just absence, like you just don't feel him anymore, even though you're doing everything you can for that. Whether it's a physical thing, that we have a lot of things, whether you lose a job or whether you have a loss in the family or a friend or a loved one. We all deal with some serious issues and some hurts and pains and brokenness. But I want to encourage everybody that God does promise us the drought will end and the rain will come.